Engines throbbed softly in the night as American carriers pressed westward, their wakes glowing faintly in phosphorescent trails. On flight decks, sailors moved with hushed precision, voices carried only as whispers against the wind. The Pacific stretched endlessly before them, a theatre so vast that even mighty fleets seemed to vanish in its immensity. Far below the decks, engineers checked oil pressure and turbine temperatures, the heartbeat of the war machine steady and relentless. Above, the stars hung brilliantly clear, each one mirrored in the black water like a reminder of eternity. A lookout, Seaman First Class Robert Hale, leaned on cold steel railing, scanning for shapes that never came. He thought of home in Kansas, where fields swayed under winds very different from the Pacific's. Outwardly, the fleet seemed at peace, but the silence carried weight heavier than words. Every man sensed that the sea, calm though it was, would soon become a graveyard. None could yet know that the largest battleship ever built was already stirring in distant harbors. At Kura Naval Arsenal in Japan, Yamato's crew prepared their behemoth for what was, at least in rumor, a mission without return. Men polished the black muzzles of her 18 one-inch guns, each barrel longer than a city bus, each shell weighing more than a small car. Captain Kosaku Ariga walked the bridge silently, studying charts illuminated by red lamps to preserve night vision. The ship's engineers checked the boilers, listening for the rhythm of turbines that could push the 70,000-ton vessel to nearly 27 knots. Sailors sat cross-legged on steel decks, writing last letters with brushes, the smell of ink mixing with machine oil. A boatswain reminded his men that honor was greater than survival, a sentiment repeated often in these final days of the empire. On shore, families gathered, bowing deeply as the giant prepared to leave its cradle. Few truly believed she would ever return. What they didn't yet know was that American scouts were already watching, their cameras capturing the shadows of every movement. The stage of Okinawa would demand everything, and Yamato would be its most tragic offering. Back across the ocean, Admiral Raymond Spruance's staff studied maps aboard the flagship Indianapolis, the dim glow of lamps reflecting off tired faces. They spoke not of glory, but of logistics, fuel consumption, pilot fatigue, and the endless strain of supplying an island-hopping war. On carrier flight decks, Hellcats and Avengers rested under tarps, their engines oiled, their wings folded like sleeping birds. Lieutenant James Carter, a pilot from California, checked his sidearm more out of habit than need, whispering a promise to return home alive. Radios crackled with routine messages, but behind them lay the expectation that Yamato, long silent, would eventually sail. The Pacific, though calm tonight, was a chessboard where every move meant thousands of lives. Each commander studied not only the horizon, but also the ticking clock that measured Japan's endurance. At dawn, squadrons would launch again to strike Okinawa, the current storm of war. None of the Americans imagined that within days, they would face the thunder of the largest guns ever mounted at sea. The sea around them, still dark, carried secrets neither side could see. In the calm before action, nature itself seemed to join the vigil. Flying fish scattered across the bow waves, their silver scales glinting in moonlight. Storm fronts brewed silently to the west, promising rain but also concealment. On Yamato, lookouts studied the same skies, unsure whether the weather was a blessing or a curse. Below decks, stokers shoveled coal and monitored pressure gauges, the heat suffocating in the giant belly of steel. "This ship will outlast us all," one sailor murmured, though he dared not say it aloud. Above him, the ship's bell rang quietly, marking the passing of another hour toward destiny. For Americans and Japanese alike, time was a relentless tide, pulling them toward collision. What neither knew was that reconnaissance planes already traced invisible lines between them. Each heartbeat brought the fleets closer to a confrontation that would redefine sea power forever. Individual stories floated like fragments on the vast tide of war. In Okinawa's villages, civilians huddled in caves, their ears filled with the rumble of naval guns from miles offshore. Children asked their mothers why the sky burned each day with new fires, and no answer could soften the truth. On an American destroyer, a young radioman named Frank Daniels clutched his headset, listening to garbled Japanese transmissions. He thought of his brother, lost at Leyte, and wondered if tonight's calm sea held his spirit. Meanwhile, on Yamato, petty officers drilled gunners, shouting commands over the clang of shells loaded into hoists. The weaponry was magnificent, but its scale seemed grotesque when compared to the fragile men who manned it. Each sailor carried the unspoken awareness that steel could not shield them from the storm of planes that surely awaited. Already, whispers of one-way missions spread like smoke in the corridors. No one imagined this voyage would end not in triumph, but in fire and silence. Yet in these hours of calm, hope still lingered, fragile as a flame in the wind. The Pacific's immensity had a way of reducing giants to shadows. Even Yamato, larger than any battleship afloat, seemed small against the endless horizon. From high above, reconnaissance pilots described fleets as dots crawling across a blue canvas, specks of steel dwarfed by waves and sky. And yet, within those dots, lay thousands of lives, each heartbeat part of a machine grinding toward collision. On American carriers, chaplains walked the decks, offering quiet prayers to men who masked their fear with humor. On Yamato, Buddhist sutras were whispered under breath, beads clenched in rough hands. Two cultures, worlds apart, faced the same silence of the sea, the same inevitability of death. The ocean, impartial and ancient, would claim whichever it chose without preference. What the admirals plotted, and what the sailors endured, would soon converge. Tonight, however, the sea still held them gently, as though mocking the storms to come. Dawn approached slowly, a pale line breaking across the eastern sky. Sailors on both sides tightened their coats against the chill, watching as light unveiled the immensity around them. The sea, once black, turned silver, reflecting clouds tinged with crimson. Engines roared to life, their echoes rolling over calm waves like distant thunder. On Yamato, Ariga stood at the bridge rail, his face unreadable, his mind already deep in the maps of Okinawa. Across the ocean, Carter and his fellow pilots adjusted goggles, blinking against the first brightness of day. None knew they would one day cross paths in skies torn by fire and steel. For now, each was simply a figure on a stage too large to comprehend. The Pacific revealed itself slowly, as if reluctant to show what it held in store. With every ray of light, the shadows of destiny grew longer. By late morning, the fleets pressed forward, unseen yet destined for collision. The sea shimmered in deceptive beauty, its calm surface masking the fury of coming battles. American sailors ate quietly in mess halls, spoons clattering against metal trays, minds far from food. Japanese crews prayed silently, knowing each mile carried them farther from home, closer to sacrifice. Reconnaissance aircraft droned in the distance, unseen sentinels that stitched both stories together. Above, gulls wheeled lazily, indifferent to the fate of men below. The Pacific remained vast, yet the war had a way of shrinking even oceans, drawing enemies toward one another like magnets. Soon the silence would end, and the calm horizon would fracture into chaos. For now, the stillness was absolute, heavy, and unforgettable. The sea was calm, but beneath its stillness, destinies already stirred. Riveters struck sparks across the steel hull as Yamato's skeleton rose from the docks of Kure in 1937, the clang of hammers echoing like a prophecy. Workers moved in swarms, dwarfed by the curving plates that would one day become the world's largest battleship. Each section required cranes the size of buildings, cables straining as if even machines resisted the weight of this dream. Engineers measured tolerances with trembling precision, knowing failure meant shame before the Navy Ministry. The shipyard smelled of smoke, sweat, and salt air drifting in from the inland sea. Families of laborers gathered at railings, pointing toward the massive shape, whispering that Japan was forging a weapon beyond imagination. Supervisors barked orders, voices lost in the thunder of rivets and the hiss of steam. Above it all, scaffolding reached skyward, a forest of steel climbing toward the rising sun. No one spoke of limits. All believed the Yamato would embody invincibility. What they didn't yet know was that this marvel of steel would face enemies far above the seas for which she was made. By 1940, the hull stretched over 860 feet, her bulk dwarfing every other vessel in the yard. Armor belts, nearly half a meter thick, were welded into place, with sparks that lit the night sky brighter than lanterns. Naval officers in crisp uniforms inspected the work daily, their notebooks filling with numbers that spoke of ambition, bordering on obsession. At full displacement, she would exceed 70,000 tons, a Leviathan meant to defy the firepower of any adversary. The pride of Kerr was not just her size, but her guns, 918 1-inch cannons, each able to hurl a 200-pound shell over 20 miles. To the workers who touched her hull, these guns seemed less like weapons than voices of a god. Children in Hiroshima whispered stories that the ship could sink islands with a single volley. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, though cautious of America's industry, still nodded at her progress as a symbol of deterrence. In her towering shape, the Empire saw more than steel. It saw destiny. Yet destiny has a way of being cruel when men confuse power with permanence. Launch day arrived on December 16, 1941, just days after Pearl Harbor shocked the world. Crowds filled the harbor, their cheers echoing as Yamato slid down greased timbers into the sea for the first time. Her massive hull displaced water in great waves that slammed against the quays, soaking children and families who screamed in awe. Captain Moriyama, chosen as an early commander, saluted stiffly as the flag of the rising sun climbed the mast. Reporters scribbled frantically, their ink running with salt spray, capturing every detail of the Empire's jewel. The imperial household sent dignitaries, for Yamato was not merely a ship but a national symbol, a fortress afloat. Women wept openly, believing this titan would shield their sons from foreign bombs. Sailors lined the deck in perfect formation, their white uniforms blinding under winter sunlight. For a moment the Empire's future seemed unsinkable. What no one imagined was that the sea itself had already chosen her grave. Inside her armored citadel, designers concealed the ship's heart with secrecy bordering on paranoia. Turrets rotated slowly under test, their hydraulics groaning like living muscle, flexing against the world. Radar arrays were added in later years, crude compared to American sets, yet seen as miracles by Japanese officers. Below, engines thrummed with the deep bass of 4 steam turbines, capable of generating 150,000 horsepower. In corridors still smelling of paint, junior sailors traced their hands across the riveted seams, whispering as if touching something sacred. Petty Officer Nakamura recalled later that he felt small, almost childlike, walking beneath the yawning barrels that pointed skyward. Yamato seemed less built than summoned, as though Japan had willed her into existence. Crews drilled tirelessly, running to battle stations until their lungs burned, knowing they served aboard something unmatched. Above deck, her profile towered like a mountain that had risen from the sea. Yet mountains erode, and no one aboard suspected how swiftly history would wear her down. At first, Yamato's might seemed untouchable. In 1942, she became flagship of the combined fleet, her command bridge hosting Admiral Yamamoto himself. Officers remembered his quiet authority as he reviewed operations, his presence amplifying the ship's symbolic weight. Crews saluted with pride, believing their nation could not fall, while Yamato stood at the fleet's heart. Stories circulated that American pilots feared even approaching her, convinced no bomb could pierce her armor. The ship's secondary batteries, 12 1-inch guns, and dozens of smaller mounts, bristled like a hedgehog of steel. Every drill, every salute, reinforced the belief that Yamato was the empire incarnate, yet her very scale made her cautious, too valuable to risk lightly. She sailed more as a threat than a weapon, a shadow that haunted American intelligence. What they didn't yet know was that this great shadow would rarely strike, and when it did, it would be against time itself. As the war lengthened, whispers of doubt grew among sailors who lived inside the steel colossus. They noticed American carriers spreading across the Pacific like floating cities, their air wings numbering hundreds. Yamato's 18-inch guns, though unmatched, struggled to find a target in a war increasingly fought in the sky. Petty Officer Shimizu recalled watching aircraft roar overhead during training, realizing that even the giant beneath his feet felt vulnerable. Inside the galleys, conversations shifted from victory to survival, though no one dared speak openly. Still, the pride of serving aboard Yamato carried its own gravity. Men felt they were chosen, guardians of Japan's last shield. Above all, Captain Ariga, who later assumed command, embodied this pride with unflinching resolve. His voice, calm and deliberate, echoed through the ship like the steady pulse of the Empire's will. Yet he too knew, in his private thoughts, that the age of battleships was slipping away. The Leviathan stirred, but in waters where wings, not steel, ruled. By 1944, the ship was no longer invincible, but her myth endured. When she sailed, fishermen bowed as her shadow crossed their boats, convinced they had witnessed a god passing. American submarines stalked her routes, reporting her movements with a mix of fear and fascination. Pilots who glimpsed her from altitude described her as a fortress bigger than an island. Inside her hull, sailors drilled under bombardment scenarios, knowing that each day brought them closer to inevitable contact. The reality of dwindling fuel and resources clashed with the legend of Yamato as savior. Japan's empire shrank, yet the battleship remained vast, a paradox adrift on an ocean of desperation. To her crew, she was both sanctuary and prison, a place of honor and of doom. None could imagine how soon she would be asked to die not for victory, but for symbolism. The Leviathan was ready, but the seas ahead promised only sacrifice. Now, in the winter of 1944, Yamato towered over the harbor, as though time itself hesitated before her presence. Her crew saluted the rising sun, their breath steaming in the cold air, their faces carved by resolve. Every plate of armor, every gleaming barrel, stood as testimony to Japan's will to endure against overwhelming odds. Admirals spoke in hushed tones, aware that the ship had become more shrine than weapon. The men who oiled her gears and polished her brass felt they were caretakers of destiny, not merely sailors. From dockside, children raised their arms toward her, as if toward a giant guardian. Yet behind the awe was silence, an unspoken knowledge that such power often dies young. Yamato was no longer just steel. She was myth, pride, and inevitability fused into one. Her prow pointed south, toward Okinawa, toward fate. She was not just a ship, she was a nation's dream forged in steel. Flames blossomed across the decks of USS Franklin as another kamikaze slammed into her superstructure. The scream of diving engines ending in thunder. Sailors sprinted through smoke-filled passageways, dragging the wounded across steel that burned beneath their boots. From the air, the sky above Okinawa was a blur of contrails, tracer fire, and the black clouds of anti-aircraft bursts. Pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy, many barely 20 years old, had taken off with full fuel tanks and no intention of returning. One such pilot, Ensign Masaru Sato, gripped his control stick so tightly his knuckles bled, his eyes fixed on a silhouette in the sea below. The Okinawa campaign had only begun, and already both sides understood its cost. Every ship that burned was testimony to the desperation of Japan and the endurance of America. The seas that once seemed endless now narrowed into a killing ground. What the Americans didn't yet know was that Japan still held one final Leviathan in reserve. Beneath the rising sun, Yamato's shadow lengthened. On the island itself, civilians huddled in caves carved into limestone, the ground trembling with each artillery barrage. Mothers pressed hands over children's mouths to quiet their cries as shells landed with thunderous inevitability. American Marines advanced yard by yard, their flamethrowers sending sheets of fire into dugouts where defenders refused to yield. The soil of Okinawa turned black with smoke and red with blood, a landscape transformed into ruin by steel and fire. Lieutenant Robert Jenkins of the 6th Marine Division recalled the unbearable stench. Gunpowder, burning wood, and human flesh mingled in the humid air. Japanese soldiers fought to the last, emerging from tunnels to throw grenades before being cut down. Above them, American corsairs screamed low, their bombs sending shockwaves that rattled the very earth. Civilians, caught in between, whispered prayers to kami and ancestors alike, their fates tied to decisions made far away in Tokyo. For Japan's high command, each life lost was measured against time gained. No one imagined this island would become the crucible that forced Yamato to sea. Inside Tokyo's war rooms, smoke from cigarettes hung heavy as planners studied maps under dim lamps. Reports from Okinawa were grim. Losses mounting, lines collapsing, civilians trapped in an inferno. Admirals shifted uneasily, their confidence worn down by months of attrition. For the Imperial Navy, once masters of the Pacific, the truth was undeniable. The fleet lay shattered, air power dwindled, fuel reserves almost gone. Yet one card remained, a symbol more than a weapon, a gamble beyond logic. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito spoke quietly, suggesting Yamato could sail on a mission of honor to break the enemy's will. The room fell silent, for all knew what such words meant. A suicide sortie, not to win, but to show Japan still had the will to resist. Outside, the cherry blossoms were falling, their petals drifting like reminders of fleeting beauty and sacrifice. Soon those blossoms would mirror sailors vanishing into the sea. While Japan weighed its desperate gamble, the Americans tightened their grip around Okinawa with relentless efficiency. General Simon Buckner oversaw waves of reinforcements landing on the beaches, bulldozers pushing aside wreckage to carve supply roads inland. Offshore, Task Force 58 formed a steel wall, carriers launching raids by the hour, their decks blackened with exhaust. Pilots, some flying their fifth mission in a single day, joked grimly about luck holding longer than fuel. The American war machine seemed inexhaustible, each loss replaced with new men and new machines. Yet, even here, fear lingered in the face of kamikaze attacks that came daily, sudden as lightning. On the destroyer USS Laffey, sailors fired every gun as wave after wave of suicide planes bore down, some skimming so low their wings clipped the waves. The price of Okinawa was already staggering, and still the island refused to fall. What they didn't yet know was that another storm was gathering, one born not of wings but of steel, and in that storm the Yamato would sail. For the Japanese defenders, Okinawa was not just another island. It was the last barrier before the home islands. Every hour gained was another chance to prepare Japan's coasts, to train boys with bamboo spears, to build more kamikaze planes. Yet the defenders on Okinawa saw little glory, only the endless rain of shells and the cries of civilians dying around them. Sergeant Kenji Watanabe clutched his Arisaka rifle in a bunker, hearing the muffled sobs of a family trapped in the cave behind him. Duty demanded sacrifice, but the reality was unbearable. Above the ground, artillery pounded ceaselessly, trees shattered into splinters, fields churned into mud. Below the ground, life was suffocation, water dripping from ceilings, air thick with smoke and fear. Commanders in Tokyo spoke of honor, but here on the island, honor tasted of blood and ash. No one could imagine how much more sacrifice would be demanded before the Empire's dream finally broke. By April 1945, the pattern of war seemed fixed. American carriers ruled the skies, Japanese planes fell like burning meteors, and the sea itself became a graveyard. Still, in the depths of despair, some planners clung to Yamato as a beacon. The ship's very presence carried the weight of Japan's myth, a final blade unsheathed even if only for ceremony. Orders began to take shape. Yamato would steam to Okinawa, carrying only enough fuel for a one-way voyage. Her mission was not to return, but to strike until destroyed, to draw fire away from the island's defenders. Sailors whispered of this plan, their fear and pride intertwined, each man knowing he had been chosen for something larger than survival. Captain Ariga accepted the burden in silence, his face carved with the knowledge of inevitability. To American intelligence, reports of Yamato's movement seemed too bold to be real, but the Empire, cornered and bleeding, was willing to gamble everything. What neither side could know was that the mission would become legend not for its triumph, but for its futility. Meanwhile, Okinawa burned with no end in sight. American artillery rained day and night, the landscape scarred into a moonscape of craters and firestorms. Families fled deeper into caves, carrying little more than rice balls and fading hope. Marines advanced steadily, but every hill became a fortress, every ravine a trap. The closer they pushed toward the island's heart, the more savage the fighting grew. Each step paid in blood. In the skies above, kamikazes struck with reckless fury, slamming into carriers, destroyers, even landing craft. Ensign Sato, whose plane left Kyushu that dawn, never returned, his fireball joining dozens of others. His sacrifice, like thousands before and after, did little to change the tide. For Japanese leaders, each such death was counted, not in victories, but in days bought. Soon they would send Yamato herself, the greatest sacrifice of all. As April deepened, the horizon darkened with inevitability. In the war rooms of Tokyo, the plan was finalized. Yamato would depart, accompanied by a small escort, on her one-way march to Okinawa. On the island, civilians felt the ground tremble with bombardments, unaware that far away, the Empire's last giant prepared to move. American sailors scanning the skies for kamikazes had no idea a thunder, even greater, lay hidden beyond the horizon. The sea, calm and blue, waited patiently, knowing it would soon cradle wreckage and men alike. For the Japanese High Command, survival was no longer strategy. Sacrifice was. Each ship, each plane, each soldier was expected to burn away so that the Empire's flame might glow a little longer. In the end, it was not hope that sent Yamato to sea, but despair disguised as duty. The Leviathan, once pride of the fleet, now stirred for her last voyage. For an empire running out of time, even sacrifice was a strategy. The clatter of boots echoed in the corridors of the Imperial Naval Headquarters, as sealed envelopes were carried to the waiting officers. Inside, orders written in precise calligraphy spelled the fate of the Yamato and her crew. The mission, codenamed Tengo, was blunt: sail to Okinawa, fight until out of ammunition, then beach the ship as a fortress, or sink with the rising sun still flying. Admiral Seiichi Ito received the words in silence, his hand steady though his heart sank under their weight. He knew Yamato carried only enough fuel for a one-way passage, a fact not hidden from any officer in the room. Arguments had already been raised. Some called the plan wasteful. Others insisted it was a necessary gesture of defiance. In the end, dissent folded into obedience, for in April 1945, there was no space left for doubt. The Emperor's empire demanded sacrifice, and the Navy would provide it. Around the table, faces glimmered under the dim light, weary but resigned. Outside, the sakura petals fell, fragile reminders of beauty destined to vanish quickly. Far from the halls of power, sailors aboard Yamato felt the ripples of the order as rumors spread through the steel decks. In the mess hall, Petty Officer Masanobu Hara folded a small piece of rice paper, writing a farewell letter to his wife and son in Kyushu. Others scribbled prayers, tucked them into uniforms, or fashioned them into offerings for shrines in the ship's chapel. No one was under any illusion fueling the Leviathan for a one-way voyage was as clear a message as any spoken words. Some tried to mask their fear with laughter, joking about Americans trembling at the sight of Yamato's guns. But when the laughter faded, silence filled the spaces between men, heavy with unspoken truth. Down below, engineers polished the 46-centimeter gun breeches, running hands across steel, meant to roar only a few more times. Above deck, officers inspected lifeboats they knew would never serve their purpose. Every clang of a wrench, every echo of footsteps, seemed to carry the gravity of finality. What they didn't yet know was that history would remember not their victory, but their sacrifice. On April 5th, the order was formally read to the officers aboard Yamato. Captain Kosaku Ariga's voice carried steady authority as he explained the mission: a sortie toward Okinawa, certain contact with overwhelming American forces, and no expectation of return. The words struck like hammer blows, yet no man interrupted. Ariga himself, known for his devotion to his crew, bowed deeply when finished, his silence an acknowledgement of the truth they all carried. The officers rose in unison, saluting as though duty alone could shield them from fear. Each man understood his place in a script already written by circumstance and desperation. From that moment forward, the Yamato was no longer a weapon of war, but an offering of honor. Above them, the ship's great pagoda mast loomed, its antennae reaching for signals that would likely never return home. Below, stokers began to prepare the giant boilers, feeding black coal and fuel oil into furnaces that would soon roar like thunder. No one imagined this chapter of the Leviathan's life would last scarcely 2 days. By dawn the next morning, Funnels belched black smoke into the sky as Yamato's engines awakened. The ground beneath the harbor at Tokiyama trembled with the thunder of her turbines, power rolling through steel that displaced 70,000 tons of water. Around her, 9 escorts gathered, a mix of light cruisers and destroyers, each one committed to sharing her fate. On the docks, workers and civilians stood in silence, hats clutched, eyes fixed on the departing giant. Some whispered prayers, others simply stared, knowing they were witnessing something final. For the sailors aboard, the sound of engines was both a comfort and a dirge. They lined the rails as the rising sun flag snapped in the wind, its red circle glowing against the morning haze. Every man carried the knowledge. This voyage was not a deployment, but a funeral procession on water. On shore, mothers and wives wept quietly, clutching children who would grow up with only memories. In the calm of that harbor, Japan's last hope slid into motion. Inside the engine rooms, temperatures soared as oil-fed furnaces devoured fuel at a staggering rate. Yamato's heart, 12 massive boilers, roared to life, pushing turbines that could drive her at over 27 knots. Crewmen stripped to the waist worked furiously, sweat soaking through rags wrapped around their foreheads. Above deck, the gunners loaded practice shells into the vast breaches, rehearsing movements drilled into them over years of training. Each 200-pound shell gleamed like a silent promise, meant to tear through steel and flame across miles of ocean. Officers reminded them that these weapons were the largest ever carried to sea, a detail that still sparked awe despite despair. Yet the reality gnawed beneath. Their enemies were carriers, not battleships, and Yamato's great guns might never fire effectively. In hushed corners, some sailors admitted the truth. This was not a battle plan, but a sentence. And still they prepared, because preparation was all that remained. What they didn't yet know was that their voyage had already been spotted from the skies. American reconnaissance aircraft, flying long patrols over Kyushu, reported unusual activity near Tokiyama. Radio transmissions were intercepted, confirming that Yamato herself was preparing to sail. The news rushed to Admiral Raymond Spruance's headquarters, was received with grim clarity. To the Americans, Yamato was not a threat to their victory, but an opportunity to strike a final blow against Japan's illusions of power. Orders were given to ready carriers and bombers, preparing swarms of planes to meet the Leviathan before she could approach Okinawa. Intelligence officers estimated her speed, fuel, and likely course, plotting a deadly net across the East China Sea. In contrast to the silence aboard Yamato, the American war machine hummed with purpose and calculation. Pilots sharpened their knives, studied target photos, and loaded fuel tanks, unaware they would soon rain destruction on men sailing towards certain death. The clash was already inevitable, the outcome already written. Yet both sides still pressed forward, bound by orders that allowed no turning back. As Yamato left the coast behind, the sailors gathered on deck, gazing back at the fading outline of Japan. For many, it was the last glimpse of home they would ever see. Some tucked away locks of hair or photographs, tokens meant to survive, even if they did not. Others whispered songs of farewell, voices carried off by the sea breeze. Captain Ariga stood at the bridge, his face set, though his heart carried the same ache as his men. He knew each of their names, each family they left behind, and the weight of their loyalty bore heavily on him. In the radio room, operators tapped coded signals to escorts, while listening to the crackle of unseen American ears. Every heartbeat seemed louder than the next, every wave heavier beneath the hull. Yamato sailed forward not as a hunter but as prey, a Leviathan moving toward the jaws of inevitability. No one aboard doubted their fate, yet all stood ready to meet it. By the afternoon of April 6th, the sun hung low over the horizon, gilding Yamato's massive guns in fading gold. The sea around her stretched endless and calm, masking the violence that was gathering just beyond sight. In the mess hall, men finished writing their last letters, sealing them with trembling hands and silent tears. Others prayed to Amaterasu, the sun goddess, hoping their sacrifice would bring light to Japan's darkest hour. From the funnels, smoke still poured, a dark ribbon marking the Leviathan's course through history. Above, American aircraft were already fanning out from carriers, engines droning like an oncoming storm. The hunters knew the prey was close, and the prey sailed knowing the hunters had already found them. Between the two forces stretched only the silence of the sea, soon to be broken by fire and steel. The moment of collision was near, inevitable and merciless. They sailed knowing the sea would be their grave. Spray rose in silver arcs as Yamato's great bow cleaved the East China Sea, the ship's mass pressing against waves too small to resist. Behind her, destroyers and cruisers followed in a solemn procession, their wakes weaving a pale lattice across the dark water. On deck, sailors leaned on rails, the salt wind stinging their faces, eyes fixed southward toward a horizon. None expected to survive crossing. Engines thundered deep below, vibrations running through boots, bulkheads, and bones alike. The task force moved as one body, a silent armada, carrying the weight of an empire's final hope. From above, gulls circled briefly before vanishing into distance, leaving only the sound of steel pushing against water. Captain Kasaku Ariga stood quietly at the bridge, his gaze unbroken, his mind already drifting between duty and farewell. The giant's guns pointing skyward seemed less weapons than monuments, steel spires etched against a pale sky. For the crew, every mile southward felt both like progress and descent. What they did not yet know was that unseen eyes already tracked their every move. High above, at 10,000 feet, the drone of twin-engine reconnaissance planes cut through clouds like invisible knives. American scouts from Task Force 58 had lifted off at dawn, instructed to sweep wide arcs across the sea for signs of Japanese movement. Pilot LT, Charles Macaulay, adjusted his instruments, squinting through a haze that shimmered in the morning light. The sea below appeared empty, vast, endless, a deceptive theater for what he would soon glimpse. Then, through the drifting veil of clouds, a shape emerged, immense, unmistakable, casting a shadow even on the water from that height. God Almighty, he whispered to himself. As the outline of Yamato came into view, he steadied his plane, snapping photographs through the mounted camera, each frame capturing the Leviathan's final voyage. His report would be transmitted in bursts of coded signal, each word pulling the American fleet closer to its prey. The hunters now knew exactly where the prey moved. No one imagined how soon this sighting would cascade into fire and ruin. Below, oblivious to the crosshairs forming in the sky, Yamato's crew carried out routines with practiced discipline. Deck divisions scrubbed salt spray from steel, rifles were checked, and watertight doors tested again and again. To an outsider, it might have seemed ordinary, just another voyage, another ship underway. But the men knew better, and their silence was heavy with that truth. Petty Officer Hara leaned against the railing, staring at the dark line of the horizon, fingering the edge of a folded letter hidden in his tunic. Another sailor beside him hummed a childhood song, soft, almost inaudible beneath the rumble of the turbines. They did not speak of death, for words made it too sharp, too real, but their eyes betrayed the thoughts none dared say aloud. The giant hull trembled with life, every bolt and rivet straining as engines churned beneath. Above, the crimson sun flag cracked in the wind, both proud and mournful. Each man felt the ocean itself was watching, keeping their secrets in its depths. The escorts kept tight formation, destroyers trailing like wolves guarding their alpha. Every few minutes their lookouts swept the skies, straining to pierce clouds for the shape of wings. Antennas twitched with bursts of coded signals, keeping the flotilla linked in fragile unity. Below deck torpedomen checked tubes again, though all knew their weapons were meager compared to what awaited them. On the cruiser Yahagi, crewmen glanced toward Yamato's massive silhouette, taking both comfort and despair in her presence. Comfort because nothing afloat matched her power, despair because power alone could not defy the skies. Smoke from funnels trailed like a dark banner across the horizon, marking their path for any who searched. Already, Japanese commanders debated the odds of reaching Okinawa unspotted, though most did not voice the futility they felt. Yamato's size was her own beacon, a monument too large to hide. What they didn't yet know was that their trail of smoke had already been read by American intelligence as a map to destruction. In the wardroom, officers sat stiff-backed over sparse meals, rice and pickles shared in silence. Words drifted between them: fuel reserves, gunnery drills, escort tactics, but always fell quiet when the truth intruded. Captain Arriga reminded them to prepare their men, not for battle alone, but for the honor of facing it without faltering. Some nodded. Others stared into their bowls, chewing mechanically as though each grain of rice might be their last. Upstairs, the ship's Shinto shrine held steady flames, where sailors slipped folded prayers into wooden boxes. The chaplain's voice rose soft against the deep rumble of engines, blessing men who clutched talismans in their hands. It was ritual against inevitability, hope against arithmetic. Each man knew they were steaming into the jaws of a storm, far greater than any typhoon. Still, no order was questioned, no duty refused. No one imagined their every ritual was already shadowed by American aircraft plotting lines of attack. Meanwhile, aboard American carriers, the photographs developed by Macaulay's crew spread across planning tables. Grainy but clear, they showed Yamato and her escorts steaming south, their wakes white against the dark sea. Admiral Mark Mitcher studied them in silence, his staff already speaking in clipped tones of strike waves, fuel loads and ordnance. To the Americans, this was not myth but target, not legend but logistics. Strike groups were ordered to stand by, pilots briefed on the colossal warship that dwarfed anything afloat. A mix of awe and disbelief spread through the ready rooms, young aviators whispering about her size, her guns, her rumored invincibility. Yet no one doubted the carrier's strength. The skies belonged to them, and Yamato could not hide beneath the sea. Mechanics worked tirelessly, fuel hoses running, bomb racks clanking as steel met steel in preparation. For the Americans, suspense was strategy. Patience sharpened into inevitability. The Leviathan had stirred, and the hunters were already circling. Back at sea, dusk painted Yamato's deck in hues of copper and shadow. Sailors gathered at the rails, the glow of cigarettes tracing faint arcs in the growing dark. Some pointed to the stars as they appeared, each constellation a reminder of stories told in childhood, far from war. Others remained quiet, listening to the rhythm of the engines below and the rush of waves against the hull. Above them, the bridge lights glowed faint and watchful, figures moving like ghosts within the steel citadel. Every man sensed the stillness before a storm, the kind that pressed on the chest and slowed the breath. Captain Eriga's silhouette loomed against the dim light of the chart room, his hand resting on the map, his gaze far away. Southward they pressed, line unbroken, speed unwavering. The ocean itself seemed to hold its breath as the Armada pushed deeper into fate. What they didn't yet know was that tomorrow, the silence would end in fire. The night closed around them, a vast cloak, pierced only by the faint glow of navigation lights and the steady pulse of engines. The Armada moved in darkness, cutting a trail that gleamed faintly in the moonlight, a mark too vast for the sea to erase quickly. In the radio rooms, operators listened to static, straining for signals they could not hear, while above, lookouts scanned skies already watched from afar. The ships pressed on, each man alone in thought, yet bound to the others by steel and oath. Their pride was quiet, their courage unspoken, but both carried them into waters that no chart could promise them safe passage through. Somewhere in the sky, unseen scouts already charted their wake, transmitting it across miles of air and ocean. The sea seemed infinite, yet the trap was already closing. Each churn of the propellers, each mile gained, drew them closer to the end. Her wake trailed across the ocean, a line that could not be erased. Engines droned steadily, at 12,000 feet, the pale morning sun glinting off the wings of a lone PBM Mariner reconnaissance plane. Lieutenant Commander Jesse Taylor pressed binoculars tight against his face, scanning the endless blue below for any sign of movement. The ocean stretched vast and quiet, but the glimmer of a wake far beneath betrayed a shadow on the surface. His radioman scribbled furiously, noting bearings and estimated speed, before sliding the message toward him with a nervous glance. Large formation, battleship-type vessel confirmed. The pencil marks read, his letters smudged by sweat. The silence in the cockpit became heavier than the hum of the engines, each man understanding the weight of what they'd just seen. Taylor exhaled slowly, gripping the headset microphone as though the words themselves might break the sky open. Sighted major enemy surface force course south, he intoned into static. What he didn't yet know was that his calm report would seal Yamato's fate before her guns ever fired. Far below, Yamato's crew was unaware of the eyes above them. Sailors leaned against steel rails, smoking their last cigarettes in the sharp April wind, while the ship's massive engines churned salt spray in her wake. The battleship looked unstoppable, her armored hull cutting the ocean in defiance of her hunters. Admiral Seiichi Ito remained on the bridge, stiff-backed, gazing through the haze as though he might will Okinawa into sight. To the men his stillness meant confidence, but privately he carried the knowledge that few expected their return. From the deck, young seaman Hiroshi Yamamoto pointed upward, squinting against the glare. A faint silver glimmer moved through the clouds, dismissed by his comrades as a trick of light. What they could not imagine was that this fleeting reflection would soon summon hundreds of enemy planes upon them. Each unnoticed shadow in the sky meant another hour lost to fate. And above, American pilots already carried their images back to the fleet. On the carrier Bunker Hill, the wardroom vibrated with a low tension as charts and photographs were laid across the long table. Admiral Mark Mitcher leaned over the map, his glasses catching the harsh fluorescent light. The radioman's report from the reconnaissance flight was still warm from the printer. The ink barely dry, a battleship, larger than any now afloat, steaming directly toward Okinawa. It could only be Yamato. Fingers traced the plotted course, intersecting it with arcs of possible air group launches, calculating fuel, weather, and daylight. The decision weighed heavy, but in truth it had already been made. They could not allow the ship to close the gap. Mitch's voice was quiet, deliberate, carrying both finality and resolve. We strike immediately. Every aircraft we can spare. What none of them realized was that Yamato's vast guns, designed for duels with steel titans, would soon be turned skyward in futility. The age of battleships was ending, even as they planned their next blow. Back in the reconnaissance plane, the men struggled against turbulence as they circled to maintain visual contact. The pilot's knuckles whitened against the control yoke, sweat trickling beneath his oxygen mask. Through the haze they could make out not just the battleship, but cruisers and destroyers in close escort, trailing plumes of smoke that marred the sky like black scars. Each minute in enemy airspace risked detection, but abandoning the sighting too early could allow Yamato to slip back into the fog of war. The photographer leaned sideways, cranking the handle on his camera until it clicked in rapid succession. Each frame, each grain of film was a bullet of evidence carried back to the fleet. The roar of the engines drowned out all words, leaving only hand signals and tense nods. A final pass revealed the enormity of the target, a behemoth still unbowed, steaming south like a force of nature. What they didn't yet know was that these images would set into motion the largest coordinated air assault ever launched against a single ship. Far out at sea, carrier decks came alive with movement as orders filtered through the fleet. Armorers rolled carts of bombs across steel planks, 500-pounders slung beneath the wings of waiting Avengers and Helldivers. Sailors fueled Corsairs and Hellcats, their hoses stinking of aviation gasoline under the merciless sun. Pilots hurried through briefings, tracing enemy formations with pencils that tapped nervously against maps. The Yamato was no ordinary target. It was the heart of Japan's naval pride, and everyone knew this mission would enter history. Men carried rosaries in their flight suits, or letters folded into breast pockets, silent rituals for luck against the unknown. On deck, aircraft engines began to snarl awake, spinning propellers that whipped the air into violent gusts. The sound was both mechanical and primal, like a drumbeat calling them to war, yet none of them could picture the fury waiting for them in Yamato's guns. They prepared as hunters, but many would become prey. Below deck, American intelligence officers decrypted Yamato's communications, piecing together fragments of code intercepted from Japanese frequencies. The hurried voices of Japanese operators betrayed stress. Their clipped syllables rushed, as though time itself was being stolen. Translators circled keywords: Okinawa, support, decisive action, confirming that the sortie was not defensive, but suicidal. The realization hardened every decision. Yamato had not been sent to win, but to die. American planners understood now that Japan had chosen sacrifice over survival, and the implications rippled across the fleet like an unseen tide. Commanders scribbled notes in the margins, knowing they were watching the end of an era unfold. Radios crackled again as spotter planes confirmed the course. Tightening the noose, the hunters had sighted their quarry, and soon the sky would close in. No one imagined that sailors aboard Yamato were writing their final letters, even as American pilots strapped into cockpits. Two worlds prepared for collision, each bound by duty, each certain of loss. On Yamato's deck, the word spread slowly but surely they had been seen. Lookouts reported the glint of aircraft at impossible altitudes. Dots in the sky that moved with predatory intent. Officers hushed their men, insisting discipline was their shield, but unease traveled faster than commands. The ship's great engines thundered harder, belching smoke that betrayed their presence to the very hunters they wished to avoid. Below, stokers shoveled coal and oil with desperate rhythm, their bodies slick with sweat as the boilers roared. Some prayed softly, invoking ancestors for protection, while others hardened themselves into silence. For many, the fear was not of death itself, but of dying unseen, swallowed by the ocean without a trace. Above, the seagulls circled, oblivious to the human storm gathering. What they didn't yet know was that the full weight of American naval aviation was already turning toward them. Time was collapsing, and the shadows above grew sharper by the hour. At last the order passed through the American fleet. Launch all available aircraft. On carriers across the Pacific, engines ignited in waves, propellers chopping the air until the very ocean seemed to vibrate. One by one, aircraft were hurled from wooden decks into the sky, each taking a path that converged on the same distant point in the sea. Pilots tightened their oxygen masks and gripped throttles, their hearts beating in rhythm with the roar of engines. They knew they were flying into history, though none could see beyond the wall of clouds that hid the Japanese behemoth. The air filled with formations, dark silhouettes spreading across the sky like a storm front. From high above, reconnaissance planes turned home. Their mission complete, the hunters had arrived. Below, Yamato's crew braced for what they could no longer deny. The ocean between them shrank with every minute, and destiny raced toward its final hour. From high above the clouds, the hunters had found their prey. The first roar came before dawn, when carrier decks shuddered under the strain of engines winding to life. Phi-6F Hellcats, TBF Avengers, and SB-2C Helldivers lined the wooden planks, their noses tilted skyward, ready for flight. Deck crews swarmed like ants, pushing, hauling, and signaling in a choreography practiced through endless drills, but now charged with urgency. Sweat glistened beneath helmets, as bombs were winched beneath wings, each clank echoing the weight of what was about to begin. Men shouted over the deafening thunder, their words carried away by the rising howl of radial engines. Pilots climbed into cockpits, strapping down with gloves, trembling more from anticipation than fear. On the flagship Bunker Hill, smoke curled from exhaust stacks, staining the bright horizon with the promise of battle. The air itself seemed taut, as if holding its breath while steel and flesh merged into machines of war. Above the din, a single green flag waved, the signal to prepare for launch. No one aboard knew yet that this morning would enter history as Yamato's final trial. On the flight deck of Essex, Ensign Robert Ellis tugged at the straps of his parachute harness, his fingers clumsy with nerves. A crewman tapped the side of his Avenger torpedo bomber, giving a quick thumbs up before sliding away into the noise. Mechanics rolled another cart of ordnance, 2 500-pound bombs rattling as they locked them into place with finality. Ellis glanced at the nose art painted on his plane. Lucky Lady, a name that now felt almost mocking under the rising sun. He thought briefly of his wife's last letter, folded in his breast pocket, then shoved the thought down as he adjusted his headset. Around him, other young men moved with similar rituals, some praying softly, others smirking in false bravado. The deck officer's whistle shrieked, and every head snapped to the signal, flags rising. Engines throttled higher, propellers biting the air with violent force, creating a storm on the deck itself. What Ellis didn't yet know was that he would soon skim the sea at mast height, staring down the barrels of Yamato's anti-aircraft guns. In that moment, fate sat quietly in his cockpit. From the bridge of the carrier Bennington, Admiral Mitcher watched as his task force transformed into a living arsenal. Squadrons were arranged in launch sequence, each aircraft assigned a role in the orchestration of destruction. Avengers would come in low with torpedoes slung under their bellies, while Helldivers rose higher, their bomb bays groaning with explosives meant to pierce armor. Hellcats would weave between them, providing escort, ready to clash with any Japanese fighters that dared appear. Orders crackled across radios, clipped voices, steady but edged with the gravity of the moment. Flight directors waved bright paddles, their motions urgent but precise, as crews sprinted to clear the decks. Below, ordnance handlers loaded racks with spare bombs, knowing each mission might be the last before nightfall. Mitchell's jaw tightened as he considered the scale of the strike. Over 300 planes would be unleashed in waves. The enemy they faced was not just a ship, but an idea of invincibility wrapped in steel. No one imagined how quickly that idea would unravel under the weight of air power. Back in the hangars, the air was thick with fuel vapors and the shouts of hurried mechanics. Grease-streaked sailors checked ammunition belts, feeding them into wing-mounted guns until the metallic rattle echoed through the cavernous space. The smell of oil and sweat mixed with the sharp tang of cordite, a reminder that every bullet had its destination waiting over the horizon. Pilots sat on wooden crates, waiting for their turn to climb into the light, their helmets dangling from gloved fingers. Some swapped half-hearted jokes, their laughter drowned out by the engines rumbling above them. Others stared at the deck overhead, silently rehearsing their attack runs in the darkness. Above them, the hangar elevators began to rise, lifting aircraft one by one into the blinding daylight. Every lift of steel was a sentence in the unfolding story, each machine a letter in the language of war. What they didn't yet know was that the enemy below already suspected their arrival. Yamato's guns prepared to claw at the sky. The hunters were sharpening their claws, but the prey was not yet silent. On the Japanese side, radio operators aboard Yamato intercepted fragments of static that hinted at American movement. The signals were faint, distorted by distance, but enough to tighten the atmosphere in the flag bridge. Admiral Eto's face remained composed, but his silence spoke louder than words. The enemy was coming. Officers passed orders briskly down the chain, readying anti-aircraft batteries, while sailors scurried to their stations. Men who had never seen combat against aircraft gripped their weapons with white-knuckled hands. Above them, mechanics adjusted elevation gears on 127 mm dual-purpose guns, their barrels already pointed toward the heavens. The dread was palpable, a silence between the thuds of boots and clanging metal. Yamato moved steadily southward, ploughing through the waves as though unaware of the eyes above. Yet in every heart, the truth gnawed. This voyage had never promised a return. No one imagined how quickly steel pride could turn to burning wreckage once the enemy descended. The launch cycle began. On Hornet's deck, the first Hellcat surged forward, its tires skimming the planks before leaping into the wind. The noise was cataclysmic, propellers shredding the air, engines straining against gravity's pull. One after another, planes roared down the runway, their wings unfolding like predatory birds catching the updraft. Deck crews crouched low against the gale, shielding their faces as exhaust flames scorched the planks. The coordination was relentless. A stream of machines lifted into the sky with the precision of a metronome. Above, formations began to assemble, circling slowly until hundreds of silhouettes darkened the sun. Below, the sea mirrored their shadows, a reflection of an armada rising into the clouds. Every launch marked the narrowing of distance, the tightening of a deadly equation that could end only one way. What they didn't yet know was that this ballet of steel and courage would become one of the defining moments in naval history. From the cockpit of a Helldiver, Lieutenant Jack Morris adjusted his goggles, his heart pounding against the harness straps. The deck rushed beneath him, then fell away as the plane lifted, the ocean suddenly endless in every direction. His gunner tapped his shoulder and pointed toward the horizon, where other squadrons already formed into tight V-shapes. The radio crackled with the voices of flight leaders, their calm directives belying the storm of nerves within each man. Morris glanced down at the bomb slung beneath his aircraft, the steel cylinder that carried more power than he alone could comprehend. He thought briefly of his father, a veteran of the last war, and wondered if this strike would be remembered the same way Verdun or the Marne had been. Behind him, the drone of dozens more engines filled the sky, a mechanical heartbeat that seemed to quicken with every mile. Clouds loomed ahead, the gateway between preparation and battle. What none of them knew was that below those clouds, Yamato's crew was already praying under their breath. Each side awaited the other, like storm and shore. By mid-morning, the Pacific sky had become alive with wings. Hundreds of aircraft fanned out across the horizon, their formations stretching until they blurred into the haze. To sailors watching from the decks of the carriers, it was as though the entire sky itself had taken flight. The sound was overwhelming, a rolling thunder that drowned the sea beneath it. Pilots exchanged silent nods, tightening their grips on throttles as they settled into attack paths. In their minds the mission was clear, the objective unmistakable: sink the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Each propeller stroke carried them closer to history, closer to fire and smoke that none would soon forget. The hunters had risen from their wooden decks, and the prey steamed unaware below. The sea waited, the sky darkened, and the moment of collision drew near, the sky filled with wings, carrying the weight of fate. The first wave descended through broken cloud, sunlight flashing off wings. As American bombers tilted into attack runs, torpedo planes dropped to mast height, skimming the whitecaps as though racing their shadows across the sea. Above them, dive bombers folded into steep plunges, engines howling as they fell like arrows from the sky. The formation stretched across miles of ocean, a coordinated storm of steel and determination. In the cockpits, pilots squinted against the glare, eyes locked on the distant grey shapes of Japanese hulls below. Radios crackled with terse commands. Steady, hold your line, release at 500 feet. To the men inside those aircraft, the sea seemed to rise up to meet them, every second pulling them closer to the Inferno. At the same time, lookouts aboard Yamato shouted warnings, their voices drowned by the rising scream of engines overhead. Gunners swung into position, clamping hands onto cold grips as the first silhouettes broke through the sky. The battle had begun not with words, but with the gravity of machines falling toward one another. On Yamato's deck, men craned their necks upward, faces pale beneath steel helmets. The massive ship vibrated as anti-aircraft batteries thundered to life, spitting orange flame into the morning sky. Shell casings clattered across the steel, as loaders heaved fresh rounds into breach after breach. Tracers arced upward like burning ropes, weaving a net of light to snare the descending planes. The air itself seemed to shatter, each detonation of a 127 mm round blooming black clouds that rocked the attacker's wings. A young sailor, Nakamura, clutched the trigger of a 25 mm cannon, his ears ringing from the recoil as he tracked a diving silhouette. He thought not of victory, but of survival, praying each round he fired might hold death at bay for a moment longer. Officers shouted over the din, ordering fire discipline, but panic coursed through the ranks as shadows grew larger against the glare. The sea around Yamato churned, frothing under the rain of steel descending from above. No one on deck could yet see how relentless the storm would become. From the cockpit of his Helldiver, Lieutenant Morris tightened his grip on the release lever, heart pounding as flak bursts jolted his plane. Black puffs exploded around him, shrapnel rattling against the fuselage like hail. His gunner shouted a warning, pointing to tracers cutting dangerously close across their path. Still, Morris kept the nose down, altimeter winding rapidly. As the target swelled in his sight, Yamato filled his vision, vast and immovable, her deck bristling with guns flashing upward in defiance. He steadied his breathing, counting down the seconds, 3,000 feet, 2,000, 1,000. At 500, he pulled the lever, and the bomb released, vanishing beneath the wing as he yanked the stick back. The plane shuddered violently, climbing out of the dive, as another explosion burst too close on the port side. Morris didn't wait to see the impact. Survival depended on pulling away before the sea claimed him. What he didn't yet know was that dozens more followed, each one adding to the growing storm. Yamato could not endure forever. Aboard the cruiser Yahagi, escorting Yamato, the crew braced as bombs struck nearby, geysers of seawater cascading over the decks. Lookouts shouted bearings, pointing frantically at torpedo bombers streaking low across the waves. Engines roared past at terrifying speed, the whine of aircraft mixing with the scream of shells from their own gunners. Men ducked instinctively as one torpedo splashed into the sea, its silver body slicing toward the hull beneath the surface. Officers shouted for evasive maneuvers, the ship groaning as her rudder fought to turn her clear. For sailors clutching railings, every second stretched unbearably, each wake in the water a possible death sentence. Above them, Yamato's silhouette loomed, drawing most of the attackers, but no vessel in the formation was safe. Fear mixed with duty, binding men to their posts as the sky itself fell upon them. No one imagined how quickly an escort built for speed and protection could become a target as glaring as the giant she guarded. The ocean had become a chessboard, and every piece was already under fire. The American torpedo squadrons pressed their runs with brutal precision, each pilot skimming just above the waves, daring the gunners to hit them. Spray lashed their canopies as the sea blurred by, the sight of Yamato's towering hull swelling larger with every heartbeat. Flak bursts tracked them, but at this low altitude, every shot was guesswork, a deadly gamble in seconds. Ensign Ellis gritted his teeth, holding his Avenger steady as he lined up for release, the torpedo slung beneath his belly, quivering with each bump of turbulence. He pulled the lever, and the weapon dropped clean, slicing into the water before vanishing into the depths. He banked sharply, heart hammering, as tracer rounds slashed past his wingtip. His gunner let out a shout of relief as they pulled away, though behind them, the torpedo carried their real message forward. Yamato's crew shouted alarms, eyes darting to the frothing wake of the incoming weapons. For a brief moment, time itself seemed suspended, waiting for steel to meet steel beneath the sea. What they didn't yet know was that each successful run narrowed Yamato's chances of survival. Inside Yamato's armored citadel, Admiral Ito gripped the railing of the bridge as the ship shuddered under near misses. The concussions reverberated through the steel bones of the Leviathan, rattling glass and echoing through passageways. Reports poured in from damage control teams, fires on deck, minor flooding. But the giant still pressed forward. His officers looked to him for steadiness, but in their eyes was the unspoken truth. They were trapped beneath the fury of the sky. The ship's great 18, 1-inch main guns, built to shatter distant battleships, were useless against enemies darting like insects overhead. Still, Orders were given to fire them skyward, and the colossal barrels swung up, belching thunder into the heavens. The recoil shook the vessel, smoke rolling across the deck as sailors covered their ears. Pilots above were stunned to see shells the size of small cars tearing into the sky. Each detonation, a reminder of the monster they faced, yet the effort was futile. A gesture of defiance rather than a weapon of defense. No one imagined that such a mighty roar could sound so powerless in the face of air power. The sea boiled with explosions as bombs and torpedoes detonated around Yamato, geysers rising higher than her towering pagoda mast. Sailors were thrown from their feet, the deck slick with oil and seawater as hoses fought to extinguish flames. Men staggered through smoke, coughing as they dragged hoses across twisted steel, their hands blistered from the heat. On the gun decks, crews continued firing blindly through choking haze, their eyes stinging but their fingers refusing to leave the triggers. A young officer shouted encouragement, his voice hoarse, trying to keep his men from breaking under the relentless pounding. Above, American squadrons wheeled back into formation, ready to dive again, their silhouettes darkening the sun like vultures circling prey. Each pass brought fresh chaos, each bomb adding to the inferno spreading across the vast warship's skin. The defenders fought desperately, yet for every plane driven away, 3 more took its place. The imbalance was unmistakable, a contest of endurance already leaning toward inevitability. Still, Yamato's flag flew, stubbornly refusing to dip against the storm. The clash reached its crescendo as wave after wave collided with steel and willpower. The sea that had been calm hours before now writhed with fire and smoke. A battleground where sky and ocean bled together. Pilots pulled away with sweat-soaked brows, their ears ringing from the shock waves of their own weapons. Gunners on Yamato fired until barrels glowed red, their hands blistered, their eyes streaming from powder smoke. Both sides were locked in a rhythm of attack and response, one pushing downward from the sky, the other clawing desperately upward. For every American who felt triumph at a clean release, there was a Japanese sailor staring upward in dread, waiting for the moment the bomb chose him. The great battleship pressed on, scarred but still afloat, the very image of defiance against overwhelming odds. Yet the sea itself seemed to conspire, swallowing each explosion and carrying echoes into the horizon. The calm ocean had been shattered, transformed into a theater of fury beyond imagination. The calm ocean erupted, sky and sea locked in fury. The sea shuddered as Yamato's forward turrets swung into place, their enormous barrels glinting under the sun. Each gun measured 1 inches across, the largest naval artillery ever mounted, dwarfing the very planes daring to strike her. Inside the turret, sweating gunners rammed massive shells, each weighing over a ton, into chambers greased with oil and sweat. The order was shouted down the voice tubes, and the decks trembled with anticipation. Above, American pilots had only seconds to brace themselves for what came next. A concussion like thunder cracked across the horizon as Yamato's guns unleashed their first salvo. The shells screamed skyward, trailing smoke, before plunging into the sea with geysers taller than buildings. Pilots jerked their controls, swerving violently as shockwaves buffeted their aircraft. Lieutenant Jack Taylor, flying a torpedo plane, later recalled the ocean erupting like a mountain beneath him. For the first time, the sky hunters felt hunted. The blasts were not random. They were calculated arcs, fired with precision by Japanese rangefinders hunched over instruments below deck. Each angle was measured, each trajectory plotted to intersect the flight paths of the enemy. Yamato's officers knew the odds were impossible, yet their resolve was unbroken. The bridge quaked as shell after shell left its chamber, the sound echoing like a drumbeat of defiance. From the sky, pilots described fountains of water rising so high they blotted out formation mates. It was like flying through earthquakes, one said, the cockpit rattling as he clutched his stick. What the pilots didn't yet know was that Yamato's main guns were never designed for anti-aircraft use. They were weapons meant for ships, not planes. Yet desperation forced them into this new role. Each blast an attempt to swat steel insects from the heavens. Below, sailors prayed between orders, their ears ringing from the constant roar. For them, the great ship was not dying quietly. It was screaming into history. Tracer fire stitched the sky as secondary guns and anti-aircraft batteries joined the cacophony. The ship became a volcano of flame and smoke, her decks bristling with barrels aimed at every angle. Crews manned the 127 dual-purpose guns, their faces blackened with soot as casings clattered at their feet. Young conscripts clung to heavy machine guns, the recoil bruising their shoulders as they poured lead upward. For every American plane that screamed down, hundreds of rounds answered. From the pilot's seat, Lieutenant John O'Neill remembered watching red lines of fire climbing past him, like a net trying to close. No one imagined that this wall of fury, though terrifying, was full of gaps. The speed and altitude of American aircraft gave them advantages Yamato's gunners could barely match. Still, each plane that dived into the maelstrom risked being torn apart by fragments of steel. Yamato had become a fortress, and the fortress was roaring. Inside the turrets the strain was unbearable. Heat built with every discharge, sweat pooling under helmets, and voices cracked from shouting commands over the endless thunder. Shell elevators clanged as they carried charges and shells from the magazines, the machinery working at its absolute limits. Sailors who had grown up tending rice fields now found themselves feeding a beast of iron, their ears ringing and lungs choking on smoke. Some scribbled quick notes to mothers and wives, stuffing them in their breast pockets before the next loading cycle. Above, they could feel the concussive thump of bombs striking nearby waters. What they didn't yet know was that their salvos, however mighty, had scored no kills. The pilots adapted, weaving through the fountains with practiced nerves, even as their stomachs tightened at each eruption. Yamato's voice was deafening, but her claws could not reach far enough. The contrast between her might and her helplessness deepened with every blast. From the American perspective, awe mixed with dread. Pilots glanced down at the monstrous ship, its guns belching flame, the ocean around it boiling with rising plumes. It looked like the earth itself was fighting back, one flyer wrote, his hands shaking on the stick. Every dive demanded precision, threading through gaps in the fire while shockwaves battered wings and rattled instruments. Some swore their engines coughed from the turbulence of exploding shells, but still they pressed on. Torpedoes slung beneath their fuselages, bombs cradled under their wings. Yamato, they knew, was the largest battleship ever built. If she survived, the invasion of Okinawa could become far bloodier. From the Japanese gunners' eyes, these planes were not just machines. They were death itself, swarming endlessly, impossible to count. The battlefield was no longer sea or sky, but a storm where men gambled seconds with their lives. And in that storm, giants still spoke. On the bridge, Admiral Seiichi Ito clutched the railing, steadying himself as the ship shuddered under recoil. His face was calm, almost resigned, but his officers saw the strain in his eyes. They knew this mission had no return, yet tradition bound them to fight until the last. The roar of the guns was both a comfort and a torment, proof that Yamato still lived, yet also a reminder of her futility. Below deck, engineers fed fuel into boilers, black smoke pouring from funnels as turbines screamed at full power. They drove her forward even as the sky darkened with attackers. What no one imagined was how quickly ammunition would be consumed in this storm of steel. Crews already counted dwindling shells, each one vanishing into the endless air without reward. And yet the rhythm continued. Load, fire, recoil, smoke, repeat. It was ritual as much as combat, an act of defiance against inevitability. The pilots circled back for new runs, adjusting their angles to avoid the worst of the barrage. Yamato's shells continued to explode with terrible grandeur, sending walls of water skyward, but the swarms pressed closer. Lieutenant Commander Paul Stevens, leading a torpedo squadron, shouted over the radio for tighter formations. His men steadied their nerves, focusing on the target that loomed larger with every second. Below, Japanese lookouts pointed skyward, shouting warnings as planes dove. Every gun roared in answer, but their timing faltered as exhaustion and chaos spread. What the Americans didn't yet know was that this display of fury only concealed Yamato's growing weakness. Her guns were thunderous, but her armor would soon be tested from angles she could not defend. The clash was reaching its crescendo, steel against sky, fury against inevitability. For both sides, time seemed suspended in the roar. As the smoke thickened, Yamato's voice boomed one last rolling salvo, the thunder carrying across miles of ocean. Pilots veered through the towering geysers, wings brushing spray as the sea convulsed beneath them. Gunners clung to their stations, ears bleeding, arms trembling, their faces lit by the flash of each discharge. The battleship had answered the sky with all her might, her voice carried in steel and flame. Yet the storm above did not relent, and the hunters pressed ever closer. The giant had spoken, but its roar could not silence the wings of destiny. The air was thick with tracer fire, and the acrid stench of powder, a storm where men disappeared in seconds. The ocean bore witness to a clash of eras, the dying cry of battleships against the rising age of air power. Even the survivors sensed they were living inside the twilight of giants. The Leviathan roared, but the sky would not be silenced. The first torpedo slammed into the water, slicing a silver arc beneath Yamato's hull, before vanishing into the dark waves. On the deck, sailors heard the distant explosion as a muffled thunder, the ship shuddering under the force. Metal groaned, and plates shifted underfoot, sending small rivets skittering across the deck. Ensign Takeda, holding a fire hose in the secondary gun area, stumbled as the shockwave shook the corridor. Smoke and spray mingled, stinging eyes and making every breath a chore. Above, Hellcats dove low, their wings slicing through clouds of flak as they prepared their next release. Bombs tore into nearby cruisers, sending water and debris skyward in jagged fountains. Officers barked orders over the chaos, voices cracking but resolute. What the sailors didn't yet know was that the relentless assault would strip their Leviathan of invincibility. Each wave pressed closer, carrying the inevitability of the sea's final claim. From the cockpit of a torpedo bomber, Lieutenant Paul Stevens peered down at the immense grey deck rushing toward him. He adjusted his throttle, trying to hold altitude as anti-aircraft fire stitched bright ribbons of orange into the sky. Below, splashes from near misses erupted like geysers, water climbing higher than the tops of masts. His bomb bay doors were locked, his focus total. A single miscalculation could send him into the sea. Behind him, wingmen twisted and banked, following precise vectors to avoid the worst of Yamato's wrath. The roar of engines and metal on metal filled the sky with relentless noise. What Stevens didn't yet know was that this mission had already become a test of endurance as much as skill. Each strike brought Yamato closer to the edge, each burst of fire a countdown to disaster. The Pacific itself seemed to quake beneath the combined fury of human machines. The line between hunter and hunted blurred with every pass. Inside Yamato's citadel, gun crews scrambled to reload, hands blistered, faces smeared with powder and sweat. Secondary guns spat shells skyward, but each eruption sent the deck quivering violently. Sailors clung to rails, shouting into the deafening roar to convey orders. Flooding alarms rang in the corridors as water seeped through riveted seams, dripping into passageways and mingling with the scent of scorched metal. Lieutenant Nakamura gritted his teeth, hauling a shell into the breach with trembling arms. "Keep firing," the turret commander yelled, voice hoarse, as another torpedo struck the port side. Every hit seemed to twist the ship slightly, groaning under stress no human could measure. Outside, plumes from bombs exploding near escorts sent spray overhead, drenching crews in icy sheets. What no one aboard yet realized was how quickly coordinated American strikes would overwhelm the once proud Armada. Yamato was still alive, but her pulse was weakening with every wave of steel and fire. The escorts fared no better. Cruiser Yahagi shuddered as torpedoes tore through the water near her hull, her steel quivering like a leaf in a storm. Decks buckled under minor blasts, sending men sprawling and instruments tumbling. Smoke rose from ruptured engine rooms as fire crews raced to contain the damage. Lookouts shouted over the roar, pointing at low-flying planes weaving between geysers of seawater. Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Sato steadied himself as a wave of water swept across the deck, carrying debris that could have shattered a smaller vessel. Across the formation, similar scenes played out: chaos, determination, and the faint sense of doom that hung in every corridor. What they didn't yet know was that Yamato's central strength could no longer shield them. The hunt was methodical, relentless, a tide that respected neither courage nor tradition. Even as sailors braced, every heartbeat carried the weight of the inevitable. Steel groaned beneath the assault, echoing like a drum of warning through the nightless day. Above, the American squadrons made repeated dives, adjusting their angles to account for massive anti-aircraft bursts. Ensign Robert Ellis pulled his Avenger into a shallow turn, the tail gunner spraying fire at unseen threats. Bombs dropped in succession, each finding its mark in wake or deck. Explosions shaking the air around them, propeller wash whipped spray into cockpits as pilots wrestled with controls, nerves frayed by the constant concussions. Lieutenant Jack Morris felt each blast reverberate through the fuselage, instruments rattling like chimes in a hurricane. Torpedoes struck in rhythm with bombs, each hit sending shockwaves through the Leviathan's steel bones. What they didn't yet know was that even the mightiest battleship could not survive the unbroken assault of coordinated air power. The sky had become a highway of fire and death, and Yamato's decks were no refuge. Each pilot pressed the advantage. Each round counted toward the inevitable. Steel groaned, fire rose, and the sea claimed its toll. In the gunners' compartments, fatigue began to show, but training kept hands on triggers. The roar of 127 mm dual-purpose guns mixed with the colossal main guns, a symphony of destruction. Shells arched skyward, only to explode harmlessly beyond the diving aircraft, sending spray across decks that were already slick. Sailors shouted in overlapping rhythm, warning one another of near misses and giving coordinates to incoming threats. Every second brought a new salvo, Every breath carried a risk of fire or shrapnel. Lieutenant Nakamura's eyes burned, throat parched from shouting, yet he refused to leave his post. The ship shuddered violently as a torpedo impacted amidships, sending him sprawling across the steel floor. Officers yelled for damage control teams, hurrying through smoke-filled corridors with buckets and hoses. What they didn't yet know was that their efforts could only delay the inevitable, not prevent it. Yamato remained upright, but she was no longer untouchable. Outside, waves crashed against the armored hull, as if the ocean itself mourned the approaching end. Torpedo wakes raced alongside, each one a streak of silver slicing through green-blue water. Decks twisted under the concussions, sending sailors tumbling like rag dolls across slippery steel. Bombs detonated on nearby cruisers, sending geysers higher than masts, and shaking Yamato's own stability. Lieutenant Commander Paul Stevens banked hard, narrowly avoiding the vertical spray, counting seconds between plunges, as if life itself depended on it. Smoke plumed from funnels, mingling with haze from explosions, obscuring the horizon, and giving the scene an almost apocalyptic hue. What the sailors and pilots didn't yet know was that this final engagement would define their memories of the Pacific forever. The dance of death had reached full intensity, and the Leviathan at its center struggled to remain whole. Chaos was no longer a warning, it was the only reality. Steel groaned, fire rose, and the sea claimed its toll. By late morning, the relentless assault had stripped any illusion of invincibility from Yamato. Fires raged across decks, water poured into compartments, and smoke choked corridors where men still fought to maintain order. Pilots circled, their focus unwavering despite heat, vibration, and danger. Gunners continued firing, though shells now mostly passed harmlessly through open sky, their power unmatched against speed and altitude. Every near miss was a warning, every strike a confirmation of the shift in naval power. Sailors braced as the great ship pitched violently, the sea swallowing shock waves from bombs and torpedoes alike. No one aboard could escape the growing certainty. Survival was slipping through their fingers like water. The ocean and sky had united in judgment, and Yamato's moment was passing. For both hunter and hunted, the battle had reached a point of no return. Steel groaned, fire rose, and the sea claimed its toll. The deck listed violently to starboard, sending sailors sliding across steel plates slick with oil and seawater. Fires leapt from ruptured compartments, smoke choking corridors and stinging eyes. Ensign Takada stumbled, clutching a railing, as a nearby explosion lifted a section of deck hatch into the air like a thrown lid. Below, radio operators frantically transmitted coordinates and final messages, voices trembling with urgency and fatigue. From the bridge, Admiral Ito gripped the railing, watching the once proud hull twist and shudder under repeated torpedo impacts. The ocean swelled with each strike, waves crashing over the deck, carrying men and debris into the deep. What they didn't yet know was that this sequence of hits would fatally compromise Yamato's stability. Engineers in the lower compartments struggled to control flooding, pumping water that gushed through shattered bulkheads faster than their machines could manage. The roar of anti-aircraft fire had diminished. The Leviathan's voice was growing faint. Each man felt the weight of inevitability pressing down with every tremor. On the starboard side, sailors clung desperately as the ship began a slow, terrifying list. The main turrets, once proud and commanding, now hung at awkward angles, their barrels swaying as if exhausted. Smoke from engine fires mingled with salt spray, creating a haze that made it almost impossible to see the horizon. Deck plates buckled under stress, sending rivets and debris tumbling like hail across the metal surface. Lieutenant Nakamura grabbed a wounded comrade, dragging him toward the starboard lifeboats that had been hastily lowered. Around him, men jumped into the ocean, their bodies swallowed immediately by churning water. From the air, pilots observed the listing hull with grim fascination, taking note of the once mighty ship, now struggling against the tide. What no one imagined was how rapidly the Leviathan would succumb to the combined fury of torpedoes and bombs. Japanese sailors shouted for order, but chaos reigned, a torrent of fire, water, and human desperation. The Titan staggered, each wave pulling her closer to the deep. In the control rooms below deck, engineers fought a losing battle against flooding and ruptured conduits. Steam hissed from broken valves, scalding men who had once worked tirelessly to propel the great ship. The engines groaned as turbines spun unevenly, struggling to maintain speed against the growing list. Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Sato checked gauges that registered dangerously low pressure, swearing under his breath as sparks danced along exposed wires. Above, gunners clung to broken mounts, firing sporadically at distant aircraft, though every shot was increasingly ineffective. The hull creaked and moaned, responding to the assault in terrifying language only those aboard could interpret. What they didn't yet know was that the cumulative damage had irreversibly compromised the ship's buoyancy. Smoke poured from chimneys, curling into the sky, as if the Leviathan were signaling its own surrender. Men moved like shadows, desperate to reach any lifeboat or hatch before the deck vanished beneath the waves. Outside, the sea churned angrily, swallowing everything not bolted to the steel monster. From the air, American pilots circled, witnessing a spectacle of controlled chaos. Splash after splash marked torpedo hits, geysers erupting violently along the weakened hull. Lieutenant Paul Stevens banked his Avenger, noting the ship's increasing tilt and the frantic movements of sailors. Bombs exploded nearby, sending seawater cascading onto decks, already slick with oil and fire. It was as though the ocean itself was swallowing her. Stevens later recounted, his voice still unsteady from the memory. Below, men clutched lifelines, some cutting ropes in desperation, as fires threatened to consume them. The Leviathan's might was still evident in the towering superstructure and massive gun barrels, but their authority had been shattered. What the sailors didn't yet know was that survival depended on abandoning the very vessel they had defended for years. The list grew more pronounced with each passing minute, each impact a nail in the coffin. The Titan staggered, each wave pulling her closer to the deep. On the bridge, Admiral Eto refused to leave his post, surveying the destruction with stoic resolve. Officers shouted orders over the roar, coordinating firefighting teams and damage control parties, though their efforts were increasingly futile. Smoke choked the air, carrying the acrid scent of burning metal and fuel. Below, young conscripts dragged hoses through flooded corridors, their faces pale and eyes wide with terror. Explosions ripped through secondary turrets, sending shells and shrapnel spinning into the air. Sailors leapt overboard in desperation, some clutching personal letters or keepsakes they had hidden in breast pockets. What they didn't yet know was that every man forced from the deck reduced the ship's ability to resist even further. Engineers continued pumping water, though each compartment surrendered more quickly than they could save it. The Leviathan's bow sank incrementally with every torpedo, water gurgling up through scuttled vents and shattered doors. The Titan staggered, each wave pulling her closer to the deep. In the aft compartments, gunners continued firing, their faces streaked with soot and sweat. Shell casings clattered across decks, warped by fire and impact, bouncing uselessly as barrels swiveled toward targets already gone. The roar of the main guns had diminished, each salvo slower and more labored than the last. Lieutenant Nakamura's hands shook as he loaded the next shell. Knowing it might be the final one fired, officers signaled through smoke-filled corridors, guiding retreating teams toward lifeboats and hatches. What they didn't yet know was that the Leviathan's centerline armor had been breached multiple times, making resistance a matter of moments, not hours. Above, American pilots circled in awe, watching the collapse of a vessel once thought invincible. Each pass brought fresh torpedo runs, each strike met by a faint, fading echo of steel fury. The ship shivered violently, deck plates rippling, funnels tilting as engines struggled. The Titan staggered, each wave pulling her closer to the deep. From the water, sailors clung to debris, their voices rising in panicked calls to comrades still aboard. Waves carried floating limbs, lifeboats and torn equipment in chaotic torrents. Smoke blurred the horizon, mingling with the spray as explosions ruptured nearby hulls of escorting ships. Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Sato scanned frantically, knowing the Leviathan's death was imminent, yet holding on to protocol and pride. What they didn't yet know was how fast the flooding in critical compartments would overwhelm structural integrity. Crews scrambled to cut lines, push off lifeboats, and survive the violent listing that could flip sections of the deck without warning. In the sky, pilots observed men tossed into the water, timing their attacks to avoid the occasional splash that might ruin their runs. Steel groaned beneath the relentless punishment, a tortured voice speaking of loss, courage, and inevitability. The ocean had become a graveyard, a swirling witness to hubris and heroism alike. The Titan staggered, each wave pulling her closer to the deep. The last hours were measured in moments, each more punishing than the previous. Smoke, fire, and spray filled every corner of Yamato. The decks no longer recognizable as they tilted sharply into the sea. Survivors clung to rails, ropes, or each other, while water rushed through shattered bulkheads, carrying them toward the yawning depths. Above, American planes continued their circling runs, engines screaming, bombs arcing in precise choreography. Inside, gunners fired their final rounds, the roar of steel, a haunting testament to their courage. Officers relayed last messages to command, voices hoarse, recording coordinates and the ship's final condition. What they didn't yet know was that within minutes, even the mighty engines would succumb to the ocean's grip. Every strike, every wave, carried the weight of a legacy ending in fire and steel. The ship groaned, shuddered, and tilted further, surrendering to inevitability. The Titan staggered, each wave pulling her closer to the deep. The deck convulsed violently beneath the last desperate efforts of the crew. Flames licked the edges of hatches, twisting smoke into spirals that vanished into the grey sky. Sailors clutched rails or each other as water poured in through shattered bulkheads, the ship listing beyond any chance of righting herself. Below deck, engineers sent frantic signals, the radio crackling with distorted voice as they tried to relay coordinates of the failing ship. A low rumble shook the hull, a warning they barely understood. Lieutenant Nakamura held a wounded comrade against the railing, both staring at the rising waves that threatened to swallow them. Above, American pilots circled in tense silence, engines humming against the roar of distant flak and the crackle of fire. What they didn't yet know was that the most catastrophic moment of Yamato's voyage was imminent. The tension stretched like a taut wire, vibrating in the minds and muscles of all who remained aboard. In that suspended breath, The Leviathan braced for her final testament. A tremor coursed through the ship. Then a deep, bone-shaking explosion erupted from amidships. The magazine had ignited, detonating with a force unimaginable even to the men who had lived through her thundering guns. Superstructure and decks ripped apart, towering pillars of flame and steel launched into the sky. Sailors were hurled into the air, some screaming, others silent in disbelief, their bodies landing in seawater, already dotted with burning debris. Oil ignited instantly, feeding fire across the waves like molten veins. Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Sato clung to a floating hatch, scorched and soaked, watching comrades disappear into the Inferno. What they didn't yet know was how quickly the explosion would obliterate every recognizable part of the ship. Pilots above froze mid-circuit, unable to comprehend the scale of destruction unfolding beneath them. The ocean seemed to rise, carrying fire and debris in a rolling, unrelenting wave. In a single instant, the pride of a nation was exposed in mortal vulnerability. The mushroom cloud climbed skyward, an unnatural plume of smoke and steam twisting into the morning light. Sailors flailed in the water, some clinging to fragments of deck or lifeboats. Others swept under the oily waves. Captain Seiichi Ito had vanished in the initial blast, leaving officers and enlisted alike to navigate chaos without command. The explosion's concussive force carried across miles, bending air and water alike into an audible shudder. Lieutenant Paul Stevens banked low in his Avenger, observing the aftermath in stunned silence. Flames reflected off the waves, painting the water in red and orange, a surreal, horrific canvas. What no one imagined was how quickly life would disperse into the open sea, leaving the ship itself unrecognizable. Smoke choked the horizon, obscuring splintered masts and twisted superstructure, leaving only fire and fragments. Those still afloat clung desperately to wreckage, eyes wide and hearts racing. In a single flash, the pride of a nation was gone. The roar of destruction gave way to a terrifying silence, broken only by the hiss of fire across the water and the distant cries of survivors. Lifeboats had capsized or burned. Sailors clung to spars and hull fragments, faces streaked with oil and tears. Lieutenant Nakamura paddled toward a floating deck plate, supporting a small group of men, each one exhausted, shocked, alive only by luck. Above, American pilots banked warily, engines humming as they tried to process the scale of what they had witnessed. Debris floated in chaotic patterns, a graveyard of steel, wood, and human lives. What they didn't yet know was that rescue efforts would be complicated by still roaring fires and scattered oil patches. The sea itself seemed to mourn, waves carrying shards of superstructure and personal effects over miles. The enormity of the explosion had left survivors disoriented, clinging to memory as much as wreckage. Even the water seemed hostile, rolling and churning in response to the ship's death throes. In a single flash, the pride of a nation was gone. Fire and smoke merged into a veil that hid the horizon, leaving only the sporadic silhouettes of struggling sailors. Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Sato kicked against the waves, guiding a small group toward calmer waters, the taste of salt and oil heavy on his tongue. Flames crept across floating timbers, burning fingers and toes of anyone unlucky enough to brush them. The ocean reflected the sky, igniting a false sense of serenity in the midst of horror. Above, pilots circled in muted awe, some muttering prayers under their breath, others silently recording coordinates for after-action reports. What they didn't yet know was how many would survive the bitter hours ahead, clinging to life amidst fire, debris, and waves. Across the sea, smaller escort ships maneuvered to rescue survivors, engines churning turbulent paths through floating wreckage. Every movement was careful, precise, a desperate ballet in the wake of annihilation. The Leviathan's skeletal remains marked a turning point in the war, a vivid reminder of human ingenuity and hubris. In a single flash, the pride of a nation was gone. Oil floated like dark ribbons across the water, igniting with every spark or ember that drifted from wreckage. Sailors clutched hands and spars, faces burned by smoke and sun, eyes wide from terror and exhaustion. Lieutenant Takeda paddled through the oily waves, passing bodies that would never return to the shore. Above, planes circled, engines humming low, shadows passing across the churning water. What no one aboard realized was how quickly the Inferno would claim floating wreckage, leaving only the most fortunate clinging to fragments. The magnitude of the explosion had created a deadly radius, where survival was a matter of inches and seconds. Smoke continued to rise, the plume visible for miles, a grim testament to human endeavor undone. Even the sky seemed to mourn, clouds absorbing the heat and fire in a muted grey embrace. Each wave threatened to wash away memory along with life. In a single flash, the pride of a nation was gone. Survivors huddled together, drawing warmth from human contact against the freezing spray of the Pacific. The cries of the injured mingled with the crackle of distant fires, creating a haunting chorus of despair. Lieutenant Commander Sato clung to a fragment of deck plating, eyes scanning for any signs of lifeboats or rescuers. Pilots above circled in awe and silence, noting the scale of the disaster with the professionalism of observers forced into reverence. What they didn't yet know was how this single cataclysm would echo through Japanese naval tradition, becoming a symbol of sacrifice and futility. Flashes of light from burning wreckage lit the waves like ghostly markers, floating reminders of what had been lost. Some survivors called out names of comrades lost just moments before, voices swallowed quickly by wind and wave. The ocean itself had become both grave and stage for the final act of the Leviathan. The memory of the explosion would linger in every man who witnessed it. In a single flash, the pride of a nation was gone. By late afternoon, the smoke had begun to thin, revealing only scattered debris across the dark waters. Sailors still afloat shivered, exhausted from hours of clinging to wreckage, their eyes scanning for the faintest sign of rescue. Fires burned in isolated patches, sending twisted reflections across the waves. Above, American pilots circled one last time, silent in acknowledgement of the scale of destruction they had witnessed. Lieutenant Paul Stevens wrote in his log that he had seen a battleship vanish in seconds, leaving behind only fire, smoke, and stunned survivors. What they didn't yet know was that Yamato's story, though ended, would live on as a symbol of industrial might, sacrifice, and inevitability. Rescue vessels approached slowly, navigating the oily waters and floating wreckage with cautious precision. Men held on to hope, voices hoarse, bodies trembling, as the enormity of what had been lost began to sink in. History had marked the day with a singular, terrifying spectacle of fire and steel. In a single flash, the pride of a nation was gone. The sea was a moving graveyard, dotted with floating timbers and the occasional figure clinging to wreckage. Ensign Takeda paddled weakly, gripping a splintered deck plate, while his eyes scanned the horizon for any sign of fellow sailors. Smoke from the distant explosion of Yamato's magazine still hung low, curling across waves like a phantom ribbon. The water was slick with oil, coating hair, skin, and uniforms. A sticky reminder of fire and steel. Nearby, a small group huddled together, teeth chattering against the cold spray, murmuring names and offering whispered reassurances. From above, American pilots circled cautiously, engines thrumming low, their gaze scanning the survivors without intervention. What they didn't yet know was that the currents would scatter these men over miles, separating friends and comrades. Every movement in the water carried risk. One wrong stroke could mean slipping beneath floating debris into the dark Pacific. Survivors pressed on, clinging to life with a stubborn, raw determination. The ocean closed over her, leaving only silence and scattered lives. Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Sato kept one hand on a floating hatch, the other gripping a comrade's sleeve, their eyes bloodshot and faces blackened with soot. Each wave pitched and rolled, threatening to rip them from the fragile refuge they had found. The air was thick with the smell of oil, salt, and burning steel, searing memories into every breath. Around them, other sailors paddled or drifted, some screaming for help, others staring blankly at the sky, numb with shock. What they didn't yet know was how long they would survive before rescuers could arrive, or if the currents would carry them back to land. In the distance, the quiet hum of carrier engines echoed across the water, a stark contrast to the inferno that had claimed Yamato. Pilots above observed the drifting figures, their notebooks filling with coordinates and sparse notes of the human toll. The survivors' faces told stories of courage, terror, and disbelief, frozen in time against the endless blue. Each man clung to memory as fiercely as to any piece of wreckage. The ocean closed over her, leaving only silence and scattered lives. The oil-slick waves reflected the muted light of a waning sun, casting a golden haze across the floating debris. Sailors shivered as they drifted, muscles cramping, energy sapped from hours of clinging to wreckage. Lieutenant Nakamura tried to comfort a young conscript, whispering that rescue was coming, though his own voice trembled with doubt. Splintered pieces of deck, lifeboats, and scattered artillery littered the water, remnants of a Leviathan reduced to fragments. What they didn't yet know was how many of them would survive the night, exposed to wind, cold, and exhaustion. A distant aircraft banked overhead, engines low, pilots keeping careful watch on drifting survivors. Some clutched personal keepsakes, letters, photographs, trinkets tightly pressed to their chest, a fragile connection to the lives left behind. The quiet sea contrasted sharply with the memory of the explosion, the water holding the echoes of fire and steel in its folds. Every splash, every movement was a reminder of the fragility of human life. The ocean closed over her, leaving only silence and scattered lives. In one small raft, Lieutenant Takeda counted heads, realizing friends and comrades had vanished, swept away by the waves or flames. Salt stung open wounds, oil clogged mouths and eyes, and exhaustion weighed on every limb like chains. Around them, groups formed and dispersed, a floating mosaic of despair, hope, and survival. American pilots maintained altitude, circling silently, some observing the human tragedy in muted respect, others noting coordinates for future reports. What no one aboard realized was that the ocean itself would dictate who survived, carrying some toward rescue and leaving others in drifting isolation. Every minute spent afloat was a battle against tide, fatigue, and the creeping cold. Men whispered names of those lost, some praying, others staring blankly, speechless before the magnitude of what had been destroyed. Even the occasional seagull seemed startled, wheeling over the slick waters in uneasy flight. The sea had become both tomb and cradle, preserving life even amidst ruin. The ocean closed over her, leaving only silence and scattered lives. Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Sato adjusted a floating plank beneath his chest, keeping several men partially upright in the churning water. Oil and debris clung to every exposed surface, a grim reminder of the fiery death of their ship. Waves tossed bodies, lifeboats, and shattered equipment into each other, creating new hazards with every swell. What they didn't yet know was how fragile their grip on life had become, how quickly exhaustion would claim even the strongest. Pilots above circled steadily, engines vibrating like a heartbeat over the water, marking positions and witnessing the human toll. A faint sun glimmered off distant waves, creating the illusion of calm, though below lay chaos, grief, and shock. Each man relied on instinct, memory, and fleeting luck to remain afloat. Shouts of the injured echoed faintly, fading into the whispering wind and ocean spray. The survivors clung to fragments, each movement calculated, deliberate, vital. The ocean closed over her, leaving only silence and scattered lives. In the distance, the decks of American carriers lay quiet after the storm, planes secured, crews exhausted, eyes still haunted by what they had witnessed. Lieutenant Paul Stevens logged the coordinates of survivors, reflecting silently on the destruction of the Leviathan below. The scale of the loss was staggering. Even from above, the remnants of Yamato painted the water with fire, steel, and human lives. What they didn't yet know was how these images would imprint themselves on history, a grim lesson in industrial might and human cost. Survivors clung to each other, talking in whispers, sharing names and memories to ward off the creeping despair. Each wave rolled over fragments of the mighty ship, carrying away the last physical traces of her presence. The water reflected a pale sun, shimmering over a graveyard of floating debris, survivors' eyes staring at the horizon. Small fires dotted the surface, patches of oil igniting in the breeze, consuming anything left from the hull. Even the wind seemed to pause, carrying the faint, acrid scent of destruction. The ocean closed over her, leaving only silence and scattered lives. Young conscripts huddled against older sailors, drawing warmth from each other's bodies, a fragile shield against the cold and shock. Lieutenant Nakamura surveyed the floating expanse, recognizing faces and fragments of those he had trained, fought, and lived alongside. Oil glistened like black glass across the waves, flames flickering across the surface in haunting beauty. What they didn't yet know was how these hours adrift would carve themselves into memory, shaping each man's future with trauma, grief, and survival instinct. American pilots occasionally dipped lower, scanning for signs of life, engines humming quietly in a somber vigil. The sun sank toward the horizon, casting long shadows over oil-slick waters, giving the impression of endless night. Survivors whispered prayers, recounted final words, and clung to floating timbers, each breath a testament to endurance. The sea, indifferent and eternal, held them gently yet firmly, a paradox of danger and salvation. Each movement carried both hope and despair in equal measure. The ocean closed over her, leaving only silence and scattered lives. As evening fell, waves lapped gently against fragments of the Leviathan, carrying survivors slowly toward whatever mercy the Pacific would allow. The scale of destruction had left the sea a patchwork of floating fire, debris, and human life. Lieutenant Commander Sato counted survivors again, noting who remained, who had vanished in the hours since the explosion. Pilots circled in fading light, engines low, a silent audience to the aftermath of human courage and catastrophe. What they didn't yet know was how the memory of this day would echo across nations, through families, and into history books. Every survivor's gaze lingered on the empty horizon, where Yamato had disappeared, a mixture of grief, relief, and disbelief etched into every line of their faces. Fires burned low, smoke drifting lazily, marking the boundaries of what had once been the proudest ship in the Japanese fleet. The silence of the sea was profound, a stark contrast to the roar and fury that had preceded it. Gentle waves carried the living and the dead alike, dissolving boundaries between past and present, life and memory. The ocean closed over her, leaving only silence and scattered lives. The morning mist hung low over Kura harbor, curling around the rusted hulls of battleships that had once dominated the seas. Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Sato walked along the gangway of a decommissioned ship, fingers brushing the corroded steel, feeling the memory of decades of fire, smoke, and cannon. Carriers in the distance steamed steadily, engines throbbing, their air wings rising in synchronized flight drills. What they didn't yet know was how quickly the battleship, the symbol of naval might, had become an anachronism. Historians on the dockside, notebooks open, recorded details of rivets, bulkheads, and gun turrets that had once inspired awe. Survivors of Yamato and her contemporaries watched silently, the echo of cannon fire and explosions still ringing in memory. The sea lapped gently at the hulls, indifferent to their former glory. Even seagulls traced their arcs against the sky, with casual grace, oblivious to the human drama beneath. Engineers and shipbreakers moved deliberately, cutting steel plates and salvaging what could be repurposed. The age of giants had ended quietly, without fanfare, yet the weight of their absence was profound. On the bridge of an American carrier off Okinawa, Captain William Harper observed the horizon, thinking of the Leviathans that no longer ruled the waves. Aircraft carriers had proven their supremacy, wings above steel, projecting power across hundreds of miles. The roar of deck engines mixed with the distant hum of jet-like corsairs and Avengers preparing for drills. What they didn't yet know was how future naval doctrine would hinge entirely on air power, leaving battleships to history books and museum displays. Harper noted the precision with which pilots coordinated attacks, recalling the day they had found Yamato adrift and doomed. Each wave beneath the carrier seemed to carry the ghost of the past, the echoes of shells and fire blending with the lull of the Pacific. In Japanese shipyards, crews dismantled gun turrets and radar arrays, carefully labeling each piece for scrap or storage. The contrast between the silent hulks and the living, breathing carriers was stark, almost poetic. Engineers in overalls wiped sweat from foreheads, listening for the groan of steel under torches and saws. The age of giants ended not with a clash, but with wings above the waves. Lieutenant Nakamura, now decades older, wandered among the skeletons of battleships, noting the warped steel and peeling paint. Memories of fire, explosions, and the cries of comrades floated in his mind like smoke over water. Rust crept along the hull, consuming letters and markings that had once identified a proud vessel. What they didn't yet know was that these ships would become relics, monuments to industrial ambition and national pride. Carriers steamed on patrol nearby, their catapults hissing and engines pulsing, a quiet testament to the changing balance of naval warfare. Historians scribbled observations, tracing the evolution of steel and strategy, connecting the dots between Yamato's demise and the rise of air power. Occasionally, a seagull's cry pierced the harbor, a natural punctuation to the human reflection. Memories of officers and sailors, lost in battles long past, surfaced with each step along the dock. Survivors compared notes quietly, acknowledging that survival was no longer measured in firepower alone. The age of giants ended not with a clash, but with wings above the waves. In a post-war Tokyo classroom, students examined photographs of Yamato's final voyage, tracing her massive guns and iconic lines with small fingers. Teachers recounted the strategic lessons, the human cost, and the inevitability of carrier dominance. What they didn't yet know was how these stories would become legend, shaping national memory and naval doctrine alike. Meanwhile, Former pilots like Paul Stevens spoke at reunions, recounting aerial maneuvers, torpedo strikes, and the eerie silence after the explosion. The juxtaposition of airborne precision and battleship vulnerability became clear to every listener. Shipbreakers in Curie continued to dismantle hulls, the rhythmic sound of cutting torches echoing like a dirge. Historians compared logs and journals, noting the meticulous planning, the courage, and the futility inherent in Yamato's final sortie. Photographs captured both majesty and ruin, the scale of the Leviathan juxtaposed against human hands and faces. The lessons of Yamato and her sisters became as concrete as the steel they left behind. The age of giants ended not with a clash, but with wings above the waves. On a quiet afternoon in Pearl Harbor, an aging carrier captain inspected old maps, tracing the routes of Japanese fleets across the Pacific. Every line, every annotation spoke of strategy, hope, and hubris. What they didn't yet know was how swiftly the battleship's dominance had waned, eclipsed by the reach of aircraft wings and radar-guided precision. Survivors of Yamato and her escorts exchanged letters, recalling moments of courage, fear, and the surreal beauty of the Pacific battles. Rusting turrets and silent decks told the story in stark, unspoken terms. The contrast between the calm sea and past chaos was almost unbearable, a quiet echo of human ambition. Engineers explained to visiting historians the mechanical marvels of steam turbines, propulsion shafts, and massive gun barrels. They described the complexity, the labor, the human cost of constructing giants meant to rule the waves. The old maps were annotated with reflections, mistakes, and hard-earned truths. The age of giants ended not with a clash, but with wings above the waves. Across the waters of Yokosuka, once mighty battleships rested in derelict silence. Hulls streaked with rust and stories etched into steel. Sailors on shore leaves shared memories of dawn watches, gun drills, and the pride of serving aboard ships that had once seemed invincible. What they didn't yet know was that no amount of armor, no size of gun, could counter the reach of flight. Carriers sailed beyond the horizon, engines humming, air wings rising and falling in endless practice. Sorties, observers recorded every detail: rivets, torpedo doors, gun elevations, and radar arrays. The ghosts of Yamato and her sisters haunted every deck, every hatch, a presence felt even without sound. Historians reflected on how human ingenuity and strategic misjudgment intertwined in the twilight of the battleship. The silence was deafening, a stark testament to obsolescence and the passage of time. Veterans recalled both triumph and tragedy, voices low, eyes distant. The age of giants ended not with a clash, but with wings above the waves. At a naval museum, children crowded around models of Yamato and other battleships, tracing gun barrels with wide eyes, imagining fire and thunder. Guides described tonnage, firepower, and the scale of human effort involved, but also the fleeting nature of these once mighty vessels. What they didn't yet know was how these symbols of national pride had become relics, teaching lessons of courage, futility, and inevitability. Carriers steamed in exercises offshore, their air wings cutting across the sky with precision that battleships could never match. Photographs of battles, explosions, and survivors adorned museum walls, merging human story with mechanical achievement. Visitors paused, reading letters and logs, absorbing the weight of human lives intertwined with steel. Ship models displayed alongside retired turrets and fragments brought scale into stark relief. The narrative of Yamato's final voyage became more than history. It became a meditation on change, ambition, and mortality. Every story, every artifact reminded viewers that power is fleeting, even for giants. The age of giants ended not with a clash, but with wings above the waves. Even in distant archives, scholars pored over blueprints, journals, and after-action reports, tracing the rise and fall of the Leviathans with meticulous care. Lieutenant Commander Sato's recollections, now decades old, guided narratives of sacrifice, ambition, and inevitability. What they didn't yet know was how Yamato's demise would symbolize the obsolescence of the battleship in every navy across the world. Carriers projected force in ways steel alone never could, wings replacing turrets, speed eclipsing armor, rusting hulks, cut down for scrap or left to decay, became silent teachers of history. Veterans visited these hulks, touching cold metal and recalling fire, smoke, and the ocean's roar. The juxtaposition of past power and present reflection resonated deeply, a testament to human innovation and hubris alike. Historians and engineers alike acknowledged the irony: the mightiest ships fell to craft and air, not to equal steel. Every visitor, sailor and scholar left with an understanding of change, mortality, and history's unyielding currents. The age of giants ended not with a clash, but with wings above the waves. Sunlight filters through the turquoise waters above the wreck of Yamato, glinting off coral-encrusted turrets that rise like monuments from the seabed. Marine biologist divers descend cautiously, bubbles trailing like silver ribbons, cameras capturing every detail of twisted steel and ghostly shadows. Ensign Haruto Kagawa, decades after his grandfather perished aboard, peers through the viewport of a submersible, tracing the line of the once mighty hull. What they didn't yet know was that each fragment held stories of courage, fear, and human frailty, silently recorded in rust and coral. Schools of fish dart through openings where shells once screamed fire across the Pacific, now transformed into corridors of life. Historians monitor the dives from support ships above, noting positions, angles, and damage patterns that tell a story more eloquent than words alone. Every crevice and hatch bears witness to the final hours, a frozen tableau of smoke, water, and human endurance. The ocean current sways ropes of kelp over shattered gun turrets, like banners over a battlefield long silent. Each photograph, each video frame becomes a testament to memory, resilience, and the inevitability of history. The waves whisper her name still, a reminder that even the mightiest fall, and the sea remembers all. On shore, in a quiet memorial park near Kura, descendants of Yamato's crew lay wreaths beneath polished stone, engraved with the names of the lost. Children press small hands against the cool granite, tracing letters with curiosity and reverence, asking questions their parents answer in hushed tones. What they didn't yet know was how these ceremonies, repeated year after year, stitched personal loss into national memory. Veterans like Lieutenant Nakamura, stooped with age but eyes still bright, offer silent salutes, recalling comrades, heat, smoke, and the roar of engines that once defined their world. Nearby, a historian adjusts a microphone, recording oral histories, ensuring that voices once lost in the waves persist in the archives. The scent of incense mingles with salt from the nearby harbor, creating a sensory bridge between past and present. Flowers sway in the breeze, petals brushing against polished metal plaques, a tender counterpoint to the brutality once wrought by the Leviathan. Each visitor moves slowly, reverently, as if the ground itself remembers the echo of steel and fire. Flags ripple quietly above the memorial, a visual heartbeat against the sky. The waves whisper her name still, a reminder that even the mightiest fall, and the sea remembers all. Beneath the waves, the The submersible navigates between colossal fragments of deck and superstructure, light beams illuminating shells twisted and scattered across the sand. Lieutenant Commander Sato, observing the feed from a surface vessel, recalls the day Yamato's guns thundered, shaking both sky and ocean. What they didn't yet know was how the juxtaposition of coral growth and mangled steel would make this battlefield appear both tragic and surreal. Engineers note that bow plates, once 410 millimeters thick, are cracked, encrusted, yet still form an imposing silhouette in the dim light. Diver teams inspect the remains of anti-aircraft mounts, imagining the gunners' frantic firing, the tension, the heat, and the smoke that once filled these corridors. Each bubble rising from scuba regulators becomes a heartbeat in the silence, a reminder of fragile human life, juxtaposed against a monument of death and ingenuity. Sunlight flickers through holes where the sea now occupies spaces once reserved for engines and ammunition. The hull groans subtly in the shifting current, a soft, mournful echo of the battleship's past power. Even in decay, Yamato commands attention, a Leviathan resting in solemn grandeur. The waves whisper her name still, a reminder that even the mightiest fall, and the sea remembers all. In Tokyo's Naval Museum, young visitors crowd around models of Yamato and her sister ships, fingers tracing gun barrels and deck fittings, eyes wide with awe. Guides recount her specifications: 263 meters long, 72,000 tons, 18-inch guns capable of firing 460-pound shells over 42 kilometers. What they didn't yet know was how these numbers, so abstract, translated into human lives spent building, sailing, and fighting aboard these iron giants. Parents whisper stories of bravery and futility, of men who stared death in the face with quiet resolve. Artifacts like letters, navigation logs, and uniforms lie behind glass, tangible evidence of choices and consequences. Visitors pause at photos of the final mission, bombs exploding around the deck, sailors bracing, eyes wide with the immediacy of danger. The narrative becomes layered, connecting design, human experience, and history in one seamless moment. Every click of a camera or tap on glass is an acknowledgement of memory, reverence, and reflection. Children ask questions about courage, sacrifice, and the sea's power, bridging generations. The waves whisper her name still, a reminder that even the mightiest fall, and the sea remembers all. Off the coast, a research vessel hovers above the wreck, sonar pings echoing like quiet drumbeats across the ocean floor. Teams of historians and archaeologists discuss the trajectory of shells, placement of anti-aircraft guns, and the placement of crew quarters, reconstructing the moments before disaster. What they didn't yet know was how the wreck would become a global site of reflection, connecting Japan, the United States, and the wider world in shared memory. Dive lights sweep across shattered conning towers, illuminating ladders twisted by explosions and time. Every observation is catalogued meticulously, preserving what remains of the Titan for posterity. The swell moves gently, rocking cameras and submersibles, a subtle lull contrasting the violent history below. Researchers exchange stories of survivors' accounts, merging technical observation with human narrative. Even the smallest details, a bent rivet, a singed railing, speak to the scale of human endeavor and the suddenness of destruction. The ocean preserves and erases simultaneously, a paradox reflected in each careful note. The waves whisper her name still, a reminder that even the mightiest fall, and the sea remembers all. In a quiet village on Okinawa, descendants of those lost in the naval battles gather to light lanterns, sending them drifting across the water in slow procession. The flickering flames dance atop gentle waves, casting soft light on faces etched with grief, remembrance, and connection. What they didn't yet know was how these simple acts of ritual would resonate across oceans and generations, linking past sacrifice to present reflection. Sailors' names are spoken aloud, voices blending with the whisper of water and distant gulls. Children watch, eyes wide, absorbing the solemnity, learning that heroism is entwined with fragility. Small boats follow the drifting lanterns, gently nudging them away from rocks, ensuring the passage is uninterrupted. Each lantern illuminates the water, casting fleeting reflections of human memory onto the ocean's surface. The ritual is repeated every year, a heartbeat in the cycle of remembrance. Even as waves disperse the lights, the intent and emotion persist. The waves whisper her name still, a reminder that even the mightiest fall, and the sea remembers all. Diving cameras capture coral swaying gently around bow guns, encrusting their surfaces, a fragile, colorful overlay on steel that once commanded destruction. Lieutenant Nakamura, watching the live feed, touches the screen, as if reconnecting with the souls of those lost aboard his ship. What they didn't yet know was that this silent underwater cathedral would become a symbol of reconciliation, history, and human endurance. Schools of fish dart in and out of twisted gun barrels, their movements painting life across a grave of steel. Sunlight penetrates the surface in shifting beams, illuminating features of the ship once invisible in shadow. Observers note the subtle deformation of hull plates, signs of explosions and sinking, evidence frozen in time. The submersible glides over the wreck, leaving a trail of bubbles that rise like whispered prayers to the surface. Every detail tells a story, a record of ambition, courage, and vulnerability. Memory and history converge in the quiet spectacle, a tableau of beauty and sorrow. The waves whisper her name still, a reminder that even the mightiest fall, and the sea remembers all. As night falls, the ocean above Yamato is calm. Stars reflected like scattered lanterns across the waves, echoing the sacrifices below. Descendants, historians, and divers return to shore, carrying images, stories, and the weight of reflection with them. What they didn't yet know was how the memory of the Leviathan would persist, a touchstone of human ambition, futility, and courage for generations to come. Memorials are quiet, museums empty, yet the presence of Yamato lingers, not as a threat, but as a solemn reminder. Every fragment, every photograph, every oral account reinforces a narrative larger than steel or fire, larger than war itself. Children sleep with models on their bedside, imagining courage and history entwined in waves and sky. Veterans whisper names, tell stories in low tones, passing knowledge to those willing to listen. The ocean's currents carry both memory and sediment, erasing some traces while preserving others, just as history does. The final reflection settles over observers, a calm understanding of loss, heroism, and inevitability. The waves whisper her name still, a reminder that even the mightiest fall, and the sea remembers all.